Hello everyone, welcome to part 1 of my original 3-part course on the basics and essentials of mindfulness practice. By the end of these free videos, you should have a decent understanding of mindfulness as well as all the steps that you need to start your own mindfulness practice. The core principles of which I will be directing this course in pursuit of would be to facilitate one's engagement with life, meaningful relationships, and productive accomplishments. Notice that relaxation or less anxiety is not a core purpose. These are secondary effects at best. You will understand why later. The true beauty of mindfulness practice is that pretty much anyone can do it at any time at no financial cost. The only barrier to entry is really just understanding, and that's what these videos are for. Here are the main reasons that I think this course is better than the heap of commercial and corporate courses already out there. I look at how mindfulness, both the secular and the original Zen practices, can be used to pursue terrible anti-human purposes. This is the dark side of mindfulness, which you will not find in your typical mindfulness video or course, if at all. Do they intentionally avoid it, or is it simple ignorance? You can ask them yourself, but I think it's irresponsible to hand somebody a tool that could potentially destroy them without informing them about it first. So I'll be informing you about it. 2. I try to ground you on biological reality by explaining the function of emotions and consciousness, since it's actually quite important to have some solid ground to stand on, especially when practicing any kind of dissociation, as it's otherwise very easy to start floating off into some woo-woo territory. 3. It's free, minus some ads. Let's jump into it. The thing with mindfulness, like riding a bike, is that it's best understood through direct experience. So we're going to start with a short experiential exercise, a mindful breathing exercise. To follow along, just make yourself comfortable. Find a nice sitting posture, not too slouched, but also not too stiff. Now allow yourself to softly close your eyes. And when you're ready, allow my voice to go with you. How are we breathing today? Is it quick and shallow? Or slow and deep? Pay attention to the air being pulled in and pushed out of your lungs, and the systems that work to make this possible. This is your breathing. Allow yourself to anchor your attention to it, to focus on the experience of what it's like to be a living, breathing human being. Now, as you continue to focus on your breathing, you might have noticed that your awareness has been involuntarily pulled in other directions. Perhaps there's a physical sensation that's bothering you. Maybe you feel some movements in your stomach or gut, or some soreness from staying still. Maybe you started noticing the buzzing sound of machinery in the background, or whatever you're hearing from your environment. Maybe you find yourself thinking about other things, like what you like to do after finishing this video, or what you should have done earlier, or even just thinking about this exercise and the point of it. Whatever it is, Every time you notice your attention drifting away from the experience of your breathing, I want you to bring it back to your anchor. Return it to your breathing. If you're going to do this for 2 minutes. Now, as soon as you know you are ready to return and continue, will your eyes open? Welcome back. If this was an in-person class, I would talk to you about your experiences and ask you about them, but it isn't. So I'm going to list the most common responses, and then I want you to ask yourself some questions depending on which of those experiences fit you best. Here are the most common responses. 1. It was difficult. Many people find it quite difficult to focus and return their attention to something like breathing, especially if they get distracted by a thought that they consider more interesting or pressing. If you found the exercise difficult, ask yourself these questions and try to come up with some answers. Which part? What was the difficult part specifically? What distracted you the most? And what do you think made it particularly salient to you? Why do you think you found it difficult? Now, here's a bigger question. If you're finding it difficult to focus on a simple thing like your breath, what does that suggest about your ability to focus on more complex things? And likewise, if you found it difficult to focus in this relatively peaceful and quiet environment, what do you think that suggests about your ability to do the same in high-stress environments? Pause on the questions and try to answer them if it matches your response. Here's another common response. It was frustrating. Many people get frustrated. They're not used to sitting still and just focusing on one thing. Same thing here. Ask yourself, what was frustrating about it? How did your frustration influence your ability to pay attention to your breathing? What did you want to do instead? And where did that desire come from? Next common response. It felt pointless. I will say that this one's almost never said out loud during in-person courses, but you know that some people are thinking it, but keeping it to themselves. After all, breathing is something that comes automatically to us. No conscious effort is required to breathe. In fact, you have to use effort to not breathe. So what's the point of paying attention to it? It's a good question. If this is you, ask yourself, what if, unbeknownst to you, you habitually and chronically hyperventilate? Chronic hyperventilation is real and often goes undetected until something happens which requires medical attention. Would you be able to notice it? And if you did chronically hyperventilate, how would you know what a healthy and normal breath is like if you've habituated to chronic hyperventilation? What would that do to your blood pH levels? What would that do to the rest of your body? It's something to think about. As for breathing, why do you think mindfulness practices like to focus on the breath? What's so special about the breath? Another common response is that it was relaxing, peaceful, and no wonder. That's why mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, is a thing. It is true that most people who practice or wish to practice mindfulness, casually or not, do so for the many benefits of being in a conscious rest state, which has its healing effects. Some people even use guided meditation recordings to help them fall asleep. If you found it relaxing or peaceful, can you think of some potential scenarios where this could have been helpful? What could you have avoided there? And what did the calmness provide? What do you think happened that made you more relaxed? And finally, whatever your experience was, ask yourself this: what became of your self-concept as you managed your attention? Assuming you followed along with the exercise and you now have some firsthand experience, this is where I explain mindfulness technically and conceptually. As you listen, try to see if you can apply what you're hearing to your experiences just now. The term mindfulness on its own refers to our use of moment-to-moment metacognitive awareness. Metacognitive awareness, or metacognition, just means our awareness of our mental contents and their patterns. In short, the qualitative experience of self-consciousness. For example, if you're hungry, it's your awareness of the fact that you are a being who is currently feeling hungry. Let me explain. To be mindful is to utilize the mental ability that allows us to, first, detach from thoughts, emotions, sensations, perceptions, and self-concepts. Then observe or monitor them, as you can't actually observe something unless you are disidentified from it. And then, when you need to, control them through either direct manipulation or reframing. These three parts function together as a process to produce the phenomenological experience of mindfulness. It is our ability to disidentify from internal and external experiences, which allows us to witness the goings-on in how we come to understand ourselves, others, and the cosmos in which we together partake in. The process of mindfulness at its core is the phenomenological experience of conscious and purpose-oriented decentering. Again, mindfulness at its core is the experience of conscious and purpose-oriented decentering. The emphasis on the word conscious here is crucial because the process of decentering does not necessarily require consciousness. For example, as people may be familiar, the process of dissociation, of repression, they can occur quite autonomously without any conscious input. This is perhaps most obvious in psychiatric cases, where patients without any brain injury suffers from mutually amnesic successive multiple personalities. That is, when personality A and B knows nothing about one another. But that's a topic for another day. So if mindfulness is understood as the flowing state of conscious decentering, so it's not any specific state per se, but that movement between states, mindfulness practices are therefore exercises. They are tools designed to train our competence at consciously decentering, i.e. to better flow between these states. And this is why in our breathing exercise, we use the breath as the state for you to flow to when distracted. It is designed to train your ability to shift your focus. Now that you have an idea of what it is, I'm going to propose to you that mindfulness, or our ability to consciously decenter, is value neutral. In the same way that acquired knowledge, physical strength, or any other ability can be used for good or bad purposes. While this fact may sound obvious, this point is frequently left entirely unaddressed in commercial or corporate mindfulness programs, where it is almost always seen as entirely good or something. The point is that these are not intrinsically positive or negative abilities. Its value propositions depend entirely on the purposes to which they're directed at. It depends on what you use it for. So, how might mindfulness be used in a negative way? When thinking about where mindfulness can go wrong, it's again useful to conceptualize our ability to be mindful as a skill, and mindfulness practices as exercises to hone said skill. Skills are value neutral, generally speaking. They're competencies to be directed towards a certain purpose. For example, your ability to speak can be used to articulate truth into being, or it can be used to evade, to deceive, to manipulate. Likewise, conscious decentering can be used, for example, to either give you a sense of perspective in stressful scenarios and provide a space in which you can not only more likely adapt optimally to your environment, but also generate insights into what it means to be. Or it can use that same space to suppress or evade adaptive, cognitive, emotional, symbolic messages that are actually trying to point you towards doing something in service of optimal adaptation and the process of lifespan development. As the common wisdom goes in the field of mental health, little to no psychological processes are inherently and always adaptive, and that context must be considered for the use of practices that foster decentering. Remember that nothing about human nature is unconditional, and that includes love if you believe that words have meaning. Generally speaking, there are two types of mindfulness exercises. There's mindfulness meditation. Meditation, meaning moving towards the center, that looking inwards. It can improve your chances for insight, but it can also mess up problem solving. Then there's mindfulness contemplation, right? Contemplation, meaning to look up towards the divine, that looking outwards. It can lead to a creation of a better frame for viewing reality, but it can also lead you to jump into an inappropriate frame. Somewhat related is what Carl Jung brilliantly wrote in his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. At bottom, we discover nothing new and unknown in the mentally ill. Rather, we encounter the substratum of our own natures. That unconscious substratum that Jung described is where our innate instincts and their emotional drive states dwell. In mindfulness practices, since we are frequently dealing with emotions and emotional drive states, an understanding of them is necessary to ground you in something real. Understanding instincts, more specifically the emotional ones, as opposed to the bodily or the sensory ones, is very important here because it is primarily in the language of symbols and emotions that they communicate what affective neuroscientists call error signals to trigger consciousness, or your Freudian ego, in hopes of motivating it towards action in the world to correct for things. For example, if you feel bored, the emotional drive state of boredom and its associated feelings are not just there to torment you. It's your play instinct, which we'll be getting into in part 2, trying to inform your conscious personality with a message of bored frustration, of a lack of novelty or playful stimulation in your life. But it's still up to your conscious personality to make sense of that message and to decide what to do about it, if anything. Boredom is the instinctual play system's attempt to motivate your conscious personality towards satisfying its needs. Obviously, the message isn't perfect, it's not articulate. It doesn't come from the cortex, it comes from the brainstem. It's crude, but there is a quality to it that differentiates it from the other emotions. Like how nobody really confuses aggressive rage with caring love. Almost nobody. Emotional drive states and their emotions are primeval. That's just how old they are. Our instinctual system evolved way earlier than our faculty of knowledge did. Well, so because the signal's ambiguous and highly dependent upon our concepts about human nature, truth, and reality, one woman feeling bored may turn to hedonistic pursuits to numb the pain, so to speak. Another man may begin the great adventure his soul had longed for, reminded by a joy of being that he once had seen or felt. Someone else may turn to education of one sort or another to improve her ability and competence in what she's passionate about, so as to one day be able to proudly declare that she had been a generator of wealth, of someone who had produced more than she consumed. Yet another man may devise a destructive act to wreak resentful vengeance against the world that he says he was not voluntarily born into, a world that he sees as rotten, unjust, and somehow paradoxically also void of meaning. What we can see from different paths is that material reality and our emotions do not on their own cause our reactions to it. It is the set of ideas and values that we each individually identify with, implicitly or explicitly, that grant objects and situations the emotional salience it possesses. In other words, the ideas that run you, conscious or subconscious, tune your innate biological motivational systems to give certain emotional value to some things and not to others. It sets the goals and conditions for success and failure. The more congruent or aligned your ideas are with reality, the more adaptive your tuning of those motivational systems it's going to be. And thus, the better you can trust their emotional messages to be telling you something real and useful. If you have that trust, you're much more likely to develop better plans and to achieve better results. Now, let's have an example in the context of mindfulness. Say a woman who's living a monotonous and loveless life by her own standards decides to consciously decenter her self-concept from her feelings of bored frustration and impatient stagnation. Where does she go from there? Well, she can choose to observe it, to understand what boredom means, and therefore to consider the amount of novelty, sense of wonder, play that she's getting in her life, what that means for her based on her ideas of her own value and of human nature. Perhaps she even manages to identify seeming contradictions in the ideas that she often found herself possessed by, ideas that she had often avoided, ideas she had previously refused to think about. Maybe then, in that meditative space, a beautiful childhood memory comes up of her committing to a love of life to someone she truly admired, a memory that she had slowly forgotten or buried over the years. And so, after this decentered and sober assessment of the situation, she identifies all the parasite ideas that are holding her back and sapping away her energy, decides to grant attention and power to the part of her that screams for life, says enough is enough, and makes her long overdue first steps to turning her life around. Great! Now that's a good use of mindfulness, an excellent use of mindfulness, the ideal. Well, here's an alternative. Let's say after decentering and observing her feelings of boredom and its associated thoughts, she decides to let go of them. Since she recently read from a spiritual blog somewhere that, quote, desire is the source of suffering, she decides that it isn't that she's possessed by ideas that make her life joyless and rigidly repetitive, but that she was simply feeling wrong and not properly controlling her emotions. So she uses conscious dissociation to suppress her boredom, to avoid any necessary thought that is required for actual problem solving, to lie to herself that it's all illusory or meaningless anyway, that she was perfect exactly the way she was. She may even congratulate herself on being spiritual or enlightened and an expert in acceptance, frequently sharing spiritual quotes in social media statuses in a manner that unconsciously and secretly betrays her deep need for external approval on who she has become. She continues on with her gray, monotonous life with a daily reminder on her phone that buzzes every morning at 9 to remind her to be happy. Well, at least until she inevitably re-encounters the same feelings, now more intrusive and stronger than ever before, since nothing has actually changed. Her mental health continues to downward spiral, and in proportion, her sense of self becomes more and more fragile and reliant on approval and envy from others. Not good. Sadly, this is not as rare as it sounds, and I'm pretty sure that most of us know somebody like this. In fact, in some ways, I was like this person once too, so I would know. So if we know that mindfulness can be used for maladaptive purposes, one question might be, how bad can it really get? Well, for that, we're going to take a look at World War II Imperial Japan and the Zen soldiers that they produced. I urge everyone watching who's interested to look up World War II Japan's systematic use of conscious decentering among the militaristic populace towards the nihilistic purpose of eliminating the individual and their intrinsic value in favor of concepts like no mind, emptiness, killing with compassion, and just action that drove rosy-cheeked boys as young as 15 years old to part from their tearful mothers to drive planes into enemy warships. This usage of conscious decentering was pushed by nearly all of the prominent Zen masters of Buddhist sects in Japan back then, of which two of the major branches of the Rinzai Zen sect, Myoshinji and Tenryuji, have only ever so recently, in 2001, apologized for their direct past support of Japanese militarism. That's more than a century late. As Brian Dyson Victoria, a fully ordained Soto Zen priest and prominent scholar of Buddhist history, noted in 2006, quote, "Regrettably, many Western Zen leaders continue to either evade or rationalize the connection of their own Dharma lineage to Japan's past aggression. Given mindfulness's transparent connections to Zen teachings, it is not surprising that this very real dark side of conscious decentering is largely avoided in the Western literature." In this video series, I will not teach you the ills of human striving, or of pleasure, or of attachment, or of wanting things to be different, and I'll certainly not push any vague notions of peace, acceptance, or compassion, as it is typically taught to be the main purpose of conscious decentering. For me, optimal adaptation is the goal. More specifically, it's to become adaptively continuous with our environment, that environment being reality. For that to happen, instincts and their messages must be respected. Human nature is here to stay. To wrap up, I have a 2-part homework assignment for you to do before moving on to the next video. It's up to you to do it or not, but I think you'll find your answers quite interesting to refer back to going into the next part. So for the first part, I want you to write down 2 ways in which you can use conscious decentering adaptively to help with a current concern. For the second part, I want you to write down 2 ways in which you can use it to make the same concern worse. Easy peasy. 2 ways you can use it adaptively, 2 ways you can use it maladaptively. A sentence or 2 each will be perfectly fine. We'll review the answers in part 2. And that's it for part 1. I hope you found the video informative. There'll be some links to supplementary material in the descriptions below. Check that out. I highly recommend it. And if you know someone who could benefit from this, please share the video with them. Let me know your thoughts by dropping a comment below. And finally, like and subscribe for more future content on mental health and human nature. My name's Michael Chan, and I'll see you in part 2.